once I started recognizing where these practices actually came in, I would use it more maybe during the day. Like if I felt like my emotions were getting a little bit ahead of me, it's a really good way of really detaching from like the thoughts that are going on in your mind. And definitely this is where education has to come in before, because if you don't recognize that these thoughts are kind of like coming up and that you're perhaps like going down the rabbit hole of those emotions, then it's really difficult to really know, okay, will this be like an actually a good place for me to start practicing a bit of breath work, but more so as a way of like detaching and saying, is what my mind saying really real? Is it just like a fraction of imagination? Are these thoughts actually serving me? This is where I truly believe that thoughts, as much as we can't control them, we can pay attention to the ones that serve us versus the ones that don't serve us, right? The ones that bring us joy and happiness and push us in the right direction in terms of where we want to go. Great, listen to them. But everything that is around, I don't know, the fear around wakefulness or that there's some kind of threat, that these are the thoughts that we can learn to not fully like ignore, but I mean, pay attention to and try not to get too wrapped up in the story that is being told.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special episode where we have Coach Fiona with us. Welcome back.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Super glad to see you here. And for those of you who don't know Fiona, you shared your entire story in an episode with Coach Ali. So definitely check that out that one out for anyone who wants to hear Fiona's entire story. But today we're going to be focusing on present awareness and how that can really, really help when we're in a struggle like insomnia. And you're going to host a webinar coming up soon where you're going to specifically talk about this. But maybe start telling us how kind of present moment awareness was helpful in your journey, Fiona.
Yeah, definitely. So, as I kind of mentioned in that story with Ali, and similarly to her, I'm also a yoga teacher. And when I first started struggling with insomnia, it yoga no longer really helped, I guess, because I tried to almost like start doing all of those practices as a way of gaining control over my sleep. But once I started kind of shifting my perspective on knowing that everything that was kind of going on were these uncontrollable thoughts that were popping up in my mind, I kind of shifted my perspective into seeing these wellness practices as almost like a tool that would help me come back to the present moment, remind myself that all these like, I guess, alarming thoughts that were going around in my head, this story that I was telling myself around sleep and specifically wakefulness was purely that. It helped me really anchor down and realize that what I was maybe thinking about was perhaps not the true story. And this is where these practices, again, never to be kind of used as a means to make yourself sleep. I think very often insomniacs do make that mistake. It's like, well, I'm doing all of these things, like, why isn't it helping? And as someone who, one, teaches this, and two, has been there myself, I think that it's more understanding what these practices are and how they can actually be a tool during our recovery as opposed to like a means to an end.
Yeah. And for you, did you kind of intuitively come to this understanding that, aha, I've been using yoga to achieve peace of mind or keep sleep, but that's not helpful. Maybe I can use it, quote unquote, just for the purpose of enjoying the present moment of being here? Or did somebody tell you something that shifted your mindset? Or how did you arrive to that kind of insight yourself?
Yeah, it's an excellent question because it took me a really long time to actually realize this. Because yoga and meditation had always been like my clutch. It had always been my safe space. And then when I started struggling with insomnia, I of course started implementing these activities like on overdrive. And quite a lot of months went by where I was continuously, I said, okay, well, I'm going to meditate every single day. Like, has to be the solution. Even if I don't see the light right now, like, it will eventually work. I think it was once my sister who like pointed it out to me. She said, like, you're being a little bit obsessive about what you do and do not have to do. And I think that by then I had also come across some of your teachings and it maybe made a little bit of sense of like, okay, well, maybe I am using this as some kind of sleep effort. And that's where I started shifting my perspective and knowing like, wow, well, they are helpful, but not for the intention I was originally using them for.
Exactly. And from that moment, Fiona, did it kind of click pretty easily for you and things started to change, or did it take a while before you kind of saw how you could, use this, these tools, if you will, in a different way?
And it did really click, I guess, for me specifically. More so because I've been in this space for a while regarding or specifically like the yoga space. And I think sometimes like it does take someone else maybe pointing things out to you and maybe the right person at the right time. Like I do really think that that also is very, very true for insomnia recovery. Like sometimes you just don't want to hear it or you're just not ready to hear a certain kind of information. You're somewhat in denial, right? Like especially when something's worked for such a long time, you're like, okay, well, how could this actually not be working? It's quite difficult to accept. But yeah, from that moment onwards, I it did actually take a huge amount of stress off of my shoulders because I almost came back to a place where I can enjoy these practices for something else entirely, as opposed to like all of this pressure that I had added to it in a way. Like I had definitely like sucked out the enjoyment out of meditating or doing yoga because it felt like I had to do it in order to regulate my emotions. When in reality, that's almost like a byproduct of these practices. Like you can't really go in and say like I need to do yoga so that I can regulate my practices. It's like, well, no, you implement practices that have some kind of um like chain effect or like domino effect. And sometimes that means like, okay, well, you feel like you can regulate your emotions better, but it doesn't really work the other way around.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. I was going to ask you the following. So, the webinar that you're hosting, you're going to talk about breath work. And when I'll just kind of preface it with like, when I hear that, I almost always hear people doing kind of breathing exercises as an attempt to feel calm or as an attempt to
Hmm.
sleep, whereby it's always very, very tricky, right?
Hmm.
But maybe you've had another experience, or you have a different take on this, because again, you're going to host a whole webinar on this. So tell us about maybe the webinar and or your own experiences, and we'll go from
Hmm.
there.
Yeah, of course. And I think that this is where I do invite anybody who's potentially interested in breathwork specifically for insomnia, because the webinar is very clearly going to be geared towards the idea that this is not going to make you sleep. And there's two components. It's actually not just me hosting the webinar. It's me with a colleague who's a breathwork specialist. She's trained in this field. So it's also completely safe in that regard. So she's going to bring the breathwork component, specifically practices that you can either implement one during the session and also take away with you, things that can help you anchor down from difficult moments of intense emotion, maybe breathwork practices that can help calm down your nervous system. And then I will specifically also touch on insomnia and also the educational component that is very important when we start discussing how to actually incorporate these practices for recovery.
And if
Yeah.
we and on your, like, was this something you practiced, or not really? Is this something you learned sort of like after your own struggle faded?
I practiced it during the heights of my like difficulties, again, as a means to make myself sleep. But at the same time, like oftentimes it would really work. There's certain practices that are perhaps very commonly known, like box breathing or 4-7-8 breathing, or even kind of alternative nostril breathing that tend to be very calming in nature. And oftentimes I'd like lie awake in bed at night and I'd go through rounds and rounds and rounds of this. And yes, sometimes I'd fall asleep. But then there were other times where once I started recognizing where these practices actually came in, I would use it more maybe during the day. Like if I felt like my emotions were getting a little bit ahead of me, it's a really good way of really detaching from like the thoughts that are going on in your mind. And definitely this is where education has to come in before, because if you don't recognize that these thoughts are kind of like coming up and that you're perhaps like going down the rabbit hole of those emotions, then it's really difficult to really know, okay, will this be like an actually a good place for me to start practicing a better breath work, but more so as a way of like detaching and saying, is what my mind saying really real? Is it just like a fraction of my imagination? Are these thoughts actually serving me? Because this is where I truly believe that thoughts as much as we can't control them, we can pay attention to the ones that serve us versus the ones that don't serve us, right? The ones that bring us joy and happiness and push us in the right direction in terms of where we want to go. Great, listen to them. But everything that is around, I don't know, the fear around wakefulness or that there's some kind of threat, that these are the thoughts that we can learn to not fully like ignore, but I mean, pay attention to and try not to get too wrapped up in the story that is being told.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And let me ask you this. So I can imagine that the technical aspect of a breathing technique is, I imagine, not very complicated, right? But the question then becomes sort of like what you said, like how do we know when, okay, this is a nice time for me to just focus on my breathing in a certain way, or now maybe it's not, maybe I shouldn't do that now. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd say there's no right or wrong moment. And this is where this whole idea of practice comes in, because it isn't something that you can just implement from one day to the next and say, okay, well, I've got this practice nailed down, right? This is where also with like yoga, it's a practice. It means that you continuously show up for that that thing specifically, and you kind of come into it like open eyes or open awareness. You try not to have any expectations of whatever that practice is going to give you. And I actually think that with these kinds of things, it doesn't have to start always when you're feeling low. Like I think that they have huge amounts of benefits for just learning how to be present regardless of what we're feeling, because a lot of times we live in our thoughts either way. Like we live in either the future or the past, and that is either positive or negative. And all that breathwork is really trying to do in these kinds of scenarios is kind of anchor you back and maybe bring you a little bit more in touch with what perhaps you are feeling right then and there. So I guess to answer your question, there is no right or wrong time. I'd say if this is something that is of interest to certain people, then I'd say maybe start implementing it actually when you feel good, because this is maybe when it's easier to start realizing, okay, like this is how I can slowly start to just shift my awareness, become a little bit more present, and that's all it has to be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very well said. And I, on a personal note, I've often found that when I'm, anxious, worried, and things of that nature, I like to go running, go
Mm-hmm.
jogging, right, or whatnot. And I cannot tell you a single time where I haven't felt more at ease afterwards, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
can then so easily make us think, oh, it's running is the solution for anxiety, which of course it is not, because if we
Mm-hmm.
intend for that to happen, if we're like, oh, I'm going to go for a run so I don't feel so anxious, then we try
Mm-hmm.
to push it away and it becomes stronger, right? So to
Mm-hmm.
me, I've understood that more as like, when I'm running, that makes it okay that I'm anxious. It's almost like a positive, like I have energy, I'm going to expend that energy. And when we're no longer trying to get away from a thought or an emotion, it kind of fades by itself, right? So with that in
Mm-hmm.
mind, I've thought of like almost anything that you pay attention to at the present moment, that makes it okay that you feel where you're feeling, can be helpful. So
Mm-hmm.
why are we talking so often about breathing and about our breath? And of course,
Mm-hmm.
one obvious answer is that it's always there for us, and maybe that is the
Mm-hmm.
answer. But what are your thoughts on that? Why are we so often talking about breathing in the context of like present moment awareness?
Mm-hmm. I'd say one, there's an element that there's a huge hype around it at the moment. I'm not going to deny that. Two, I'd also like to say that breath is the one thing that always happens in the present. Like if you think about it, that's all it can ever be. It's like right now. That is all it is. When you're like doing yoga, it's kind of like a continuum, or maybe other wellness practices, but the breath is always here and now. Um, but at the same time, I'm also a huge believer that this doesn't have to be a practice for everyone. And I think that this is an excellent point that you have made around your running. And I'd say that it doesn't really matter whether it's like, breath work or running or yoga, as long as you have your own personal tools that work for you in a way that maybe bring you some kind of peace. So I'm not like a huge believer that this is like the end all be all. I just invite people to be open. It might add something to your life, or maybe you decide that it's actually not for you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very, very well said. And I want to let people know how they can sign up and join the webinar. But before that, you had, I think, maybe some specific points, insights. If we haven't already talked about them, maybe you can mention them now.
What insights regarding
Yeah, I know you had
breathwork?
some kind of points that you were like, you had prepared. You had prepared some points, right, Fiona?
Yeah, but that specifically, we've kind of like
Oh,
briefly
we
covered
did.
them
We did kind of
already.
cover them, right?
Yeah, but it was just like that importance, and I think specifically emphasizing just that fact, right? That it isn't a means to an end, and this is why we invite people to join us to understand both the educational component of insomnia, of course, understand maybe what is going on if they're still in a bit of a lost phase with that, and then also just introduce a few techniques that can be done also one during the session. We'll definitely have some lead breath work during the session, and then also maybe tools that they can take away post session that could also be helpful for them.
Very, very nice. And we'll post information in the description, of course. But it helps maybe for you to say it as well. Like when is it happening, and then how can people
Mm-hmm.
join?
Yeah, so it's happening on the 6th of March at 12:30 EST. Hopefully that's a time that helps all time zones. Anastasia is based in Germany, and I know we have maybe a bit of an audience that's also based in the US. I'd say that the best way for people to sign up, I'll share the link for the sign up, and then people get the Zoom link directly into their inbox. And if people do have any questions about this topic specifically, you can also contact me directly at on my Instagram, which is, well, I'm gonna have to also link that in the description because I changed it recently.
Oh, you did? Okay, I will just link the most recent one in the description. And how long is the session, and what are kind of like what's going to happen in the session?
Yeah, so it's gonna be about an hour to 75 minutes, and it's going to start with an educational component around insomnia, then introduce breath work, how it can actually be used, then moving on to the breathwork session itself, and then a space also for Q&A, specific questions that people want to ask. And then we also have a bit of a kind of a bonus surprise slash like offer for anybody who joins, but that will be said on the actual session.
Wonderful. Sounds good. I'm looking forward to hearing more from what everybody learns in the session and having you back here as a guest. But for now, just thanks for sharing these insights with us, Fiona.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving us the space.
Anytime. Bye now.
Bye.
Hi there, it's me, Coach Daniel, and I hope it is obvious to you to what degree we at the Sleep Coach School really try to put out content that will help you on your path to peaceful sleep and peace of mind. And I hope you really enjoyed the video that you just watched. Now, some people don't learn the best by watching videos, but rather by reading. And I wanted to share a little tip with you. The books that most people really talk about having helped them is This Is Nato and Set It and Forget It. But I think most people miss out on my personal favorite, which is Tales of Courage. All of my books are available on Amazon. But Tales of Courage is special because in Tales of Courage, we've taken 26 success stories from the channel, and we've taken sort of the most powerful language, the most inspirational and educational parts of those interviews, and put them in a book. And I think it is really, really so strong, so powerful when you read those words from other people who left the struggle. And that's my little tip to you. Tales of Courage, I think, is a great book, and it's available on Amazon, of course. So if that's appealing to you, you can head over there and get a copy. But more than anything else, I just want to say thank you for being here. Thanks for supporting the channel, and can't wait to see you again. Bye for now.